How housing swallowed Canada's economy. Imagine you have $1.5 million in cash. Not imaginary money, real money. With that kind of wealth, you could buy a literal castle in Normandy, France. 12 bedrooms. Stone walls older than your country. A moat. Possibly a ghost named Pierre, judging your wine choices. Now take that same dollar, $1.5 million. Fly to Toronto or Vancouver. What do you get? A semi-detached teardown that smells like wet dog. A ceiling so low, you have to hunch like a medieval peasant. A basement with character, which is realtor code for mold. Welcome to Canada, the land of maple syrup, polite apologies, and a housing market that is quietly transformed into a financial black hole. One that doesn't just distort prices, but consumes everything around it. For decades, Canada told itself a comforting story. Housing was safe. Housing was conservative. Housing was stability. While other countries built technology giants, export industries, and productive capacity, Canada built houses, and then sold them to each other, again and again, at higher prices. At first, it felt like prosperity. Then it started to feel like dependency. And now, in 2025, it's starting to feel like suffocation. This is not a story about greedy landlords or irresponsible buyers. It's about capital misallocation, one of the most dangerous forces in economics. Because economies don't collapse when money disappears. They collapse when money flows to the wrong place. Factories create exports. Software creates scale. Machinery creates productivity. Housing does none of those things. A house does not become more productive because its price doubles. It does not generate new value. It does not export. It just sits there. Yet in Canada, housing didn't just grow. It absorbed the economy. Banks stopped funding innovation. Investors stopped backing risk. Entrepreneurs stopped trying. Why gamble on a startup? When you could buy a condo in Mississauga, do nothing, and flip it for 40%. It was logical behavior for individuals and catastrophic behavior for a nation. Today, real estate and its shadow ecosystem, finance, insurance, construction, speculation make up roughly a quarter of Canada's GDP, depending on how you measure it. That means if housing falls, everything falls. We didn't just build a bubble. We built a too-big-to-fail asset class. And once that happens, markets stop being markets. They become political. Governments can't let prices fall without losing elections. Banks can't let prices fall without risking collapse. Homeowners can't let prices fall without losing their perceived wealth. So every correction is postponed. Every downturn is softened. Every risk is kicked down the road until debt replaces income, until leverage replaces growth, until illusion replaces wealth. This video is an autopsy of how that happened. We're going to dissect how housing sucked capital away from productivity, how debt replaced wage growth, how population growth masked economic decay, how government policy turned housing into a protected class, and how Canada built a quiet caste system of owners and renters. This isn't about prices going up or down next year. This is about something much bigger. What happens when a country mistakes debt for wealth, rent-seeking for productivity, and asset inflation for economic success? Because history is clear. Nations that let speculation replace production don't crash loudly. They rot slowly. In the next section, we're going to expose the first mechanism of that rot, the great capital suck, and why Canada stopped making things and started worshipping houses instead. The great capital suck. Why Canada stopped making things? Let's start with a simple thought experiment. You're a young entrepreneur in downtown Toronto, smart, ambitious. You have an idea for a logistics startup powered by AI, something that could cut shipping costs, boost efficiency, maybe even export Canadian innovation to the world. You need capital. So you walk into a bank with your pitch deck, your projections, your confidence carefully rehearsed. The loan officer flips through the pages, nods politely. then closes the folder. This looks risky, they say. Startups fail. Markets are uncertain. We can't lend you $500,000 for this. You walk out, discouraged. Then you do something else. You walk back in 5 minutes later and say, I want to buy a one-bedroom condo built in 1982. The plumbing's questionable. The windows leak. The loan officer's face changes. Perfect. They smile. How much do you need? This isn't a joke. This is the core of Canada's economic distortion. Economies grow when capital flows into productive assets. Factories, machinery, software, research, intellectual property. These things increase output per worker. They create exports. They raise wages. Housing does none of that. And yet, in Canada, an extraordinary share of available capital has been redirected away from productivity and into residential real estate. The numbers are damning. According to OECD projections, Canada is expected to be the worst-performing advanced economy in the coming decade. Not because Canadians aren't skilled, it's not because the country lacks resources, but because business investment collapsed. While American capital poured into semiconductors, automation, cloud infrastructure, and AI. Canadian capital poured into pre-construction condos. In some recent quarters, investment in residential housing was nearly double the investment in non-residential buildings, machinery, and equipment combined. Read that again. We spend more money building places to sleep than building the tools that allow us to earn a living. This creates a feedback loop of decay. Housing returns looked spectacular. Startups looked uncertain. Manufacturing looked slow, so smart money followed the path of least resistance. Why invest in a business that might take 10 years to scale? When you could buy a townhouse in the suburbs, wait 3 years, and flip it for a tax-advantaged gain? Individually rational, collectively suicidal. This is how an economy turns inward. Instead of competing globally, it starts bidding against itself. We didn't become exporters of technology. We became landlords to each other. And here's the uncomfortable truth most people avoid. Landlording is not productivity. When a house doubles in price, it does not become twice as useful. It does not shelter more people. It does not produce more goods. The same house now simply demands more capital. That capital has to come from somewhere. It comes from higher debt, lower savings, delayed families, stagnant wages. It's when Canadians wonder why salaries lag behind the United States despite similar education levels. This is the reason. You cannot build national prosperity by selling the same houses back and forth at higher prices. That isn't an economy. It's a Ponzi structure with zoning laws. And now we're trapped. Real estate, banking, insurance, construction, and related services account for roughly 20 to 25% of Canada's GDP. If housing meaningfully corrects, the entire economic structure shakes. Banks wobble. Government revenues fall. Consumer spending collapses. So policymakers freeze. They know the system is unhealthy, but they're terrified of letting it unwind. Canada is holding a tiger by the tail. And the longer we hold on, the more dangerous it becomes to let go. In the next section, we're going to zoom in from the national balance sheet to the household level and expose the drug that kept this system alive far longer than it should have. The HELOC, the illusion of wealth, the addiction to borrowed comfort, the moment the hangover arrived. The HELOC addiction. How debt replaced wages. Let's zoom in from the national balance sheet to the kitchen table. Meet Linda and Bob. In 2015, they bought a modest suburban house for $500,000. It was a stretch, but manageable. 2 incomes, careful budgeting, a little anxiety, the normal stuff. Fast forward to 2021. That same house is now appraised at $1.2 million. On paper, Linda and Bob are wealthy. They didn't invent anything. They didn't build a company. They didn't become more productive. The asset inflated, and Canada quietly told them that inflation was success. But here's the uncomfortable question. Can you spend a house? Can you eat drywall? Can you retire on insulation? Of course not, unless you borrow against it. This is where the real engine of Canada's housing economy reveals itself. Enter the HELOC, the home equity line of credit. The most socially acceptable form of leverage ever created. The bank calls Linda and Bob. You've got $700,000 in equity just sitting there, they say. Why not put it to work? So Linda and Bob do what millions of Canadians were encouraged to do. They unlock the equity. They buy a new truck, the official vehicle of I'm financing my lifestyle with debt. They renovate the kitchen, quartz countertops, stainless steel appliances. Maybe they even put a down payment on an investment condo. This is the wealth illusion. Their income didn't rise. Their productivity didn't increase. Their net worth did on paper. So they spent, and when millions of households do this at the same time, it looks like economic growth. Retail booms. Restaurants fill up. GDP ticks higher. But it's not growth. It's consumption pulled forward from the future. By the late 2010s, Canada had become one of the most indebted household sectors on Earth. Household debt-to-income ratios climbed toward 180 to 185% higher than the United States at the peak of its pre-2008 housing bubble. And remember, the U.S. learned that lesson the hard way. After 2008, Americans deleveraged. Canadians doubled down. Because HELOs felt harmless, until rates changed. Most HELOs are variable rate loans. When interest rates hovered near zero, borrowing felt free. Servicing $100,000 cost almost nothing. Then inflation arrived. In 2022 and 2023, the Bank of Canada began hiking rates aggressively, and the hangover hit. Monthly interest payments didn't inch up, they exploded. Households that had structured their lives around cheap debt suddenly found themselves bleeding cash just to stand still. The truck payment was still there. The renovation debt was still there. The condo mortgage was still there. Oh, but the free money was gone. This is when the system's fragility became visible. Because Canada's economy is consumption-driven, if disposable income gets eaten by interest payments, people don't spend. When people don't spend, businesses suffer. When businesses suffer, layoffs follow. And then something truly surreal happened. To avoid defaults and to preserve the illusion that housing never goes down, Canadian banks introduced negative amortization on a massive scale. Here's what that means in plain English. Your monthly mortgage payment no longer covers the interest you owe. The unpaid interest is added to the principal. Your debt grows while you're paying it. In 2023 and 2024, major banks quietly admitted that a shocking portion of their mortgage books had amortization periods extending beyond 35, 40, even 70 years. 70. That's not a mortgage. That's intergenerational debt. We didn't solve the affordability problem. We postponed it and multiplied it. This is how you keep prices high without letting the system break. You turn mortgages into zombies. They keep walking. They keep paying. But they're already dead. And this reveals the true model underneath Canada's housing economy. When wages stagnated, debt replaced income. When productivity stalled, leverage replaced growth. When reality pushed back, policy bent the rules. The system didn't collapse. It adapted to survive. But survival isn't health. It's just delayed consequence. In the next section, we're going to expose the final illusion, propping this up, the idea that Canada is still growing. Because once you adjust for population, the country has already been getting poorer. This is where GDP lies, and people feel it in their bones. The population trap. When growth is just a headcount, if you listen to official statements, Canada's economy is still growing. GDP is up. The numbers look positive. The headlines sound reassuring. So why does everyone feel poorer? Why does life feel tighter, more fragile, more exhausting, even for people doing everything right? Because Canada has been using population growth as an economic painkiller. And like all painkillers, it works, until it destroys the organs underneath. Let's use a simple metaphor. Imagine a pizza party. You invite 10 people. You order 12 pizzas. Everyone eats well. Now you invite 10 more people, but you only order 1 extra pizza. Total pizza increased, but pizza per person collapsed. That's Canada. Over the last few years, the country experienced one of the fastest population surges in the developed world. In a single year, Canada added over 1 million people, the equivalent of absorbing a small European nation almost overnight. On paper, this boosts GDP. More people means more spending, more renters, more demand, more activity. But this kind of growth is shallow, because Canada didn't expand its productive capacity to match the influx. We didn't build enough homes. We didn't build enough hospitals. We didn't build enough transit. We didn't build enough high-value jobs. We just added people. This is what economists have started calling the population trap, a situation where headline GDP rises, while GDP per capita quietly falls. And GDP per capita is the number that actually matters. It's your standard of living, your purchasing power, your ability to breathe financially. On that metric, Canada has already been in a recession. Wages didn't rise to meet the surge. Productivity didn't improve. Housing costs exploded. Why? Because flooding the labor market suppresses wages. When labor is abundant, it's cheap. When labor is cheap, businesses don't invest in automation, technology, or efficiency. Why spend millions upgrading systems when you can just hire another body? So, while the United States spent the last decade investing in productivity, AI, robotics, advanced manufacturing, Canada relied on people. Warm bodies propping up cold numbers. And where did those people go? Straight into the housing grinder. Demand surged. Supply didn't. Rents spiked. This benefited existing asset holders, homeowners, landlords, investors, and crushed everyone else. Young Canadians, newcomers, renters. It became a massive wealth transfer, disguised as economic strategy, from the desperate to the comfortable. And this wasn't accidental. Governments know exactly how powerful homeowners are politically. They vote, they organize, they punish. So when housing affordability became a crisis, policymakers reached for the one thing they could not touch: prices. Instead, they expanded demand-side subsidies, savings accounts, buyer incentives, longer mortgages. All of it increased purchasing power and pushed prices even higher. Which brings us to the most dangerous part of this entire system. Canada's housing market is no longer allowed to fail. It has become too big to fall. And once an asset class reaches that status, markets stop disciplining risk. Politics takes over. In the next section, we going to confront that final layer, the moral hazard at the heart of Canada's housing system. How banks were insulated. How risk was socialized. How a nation quietly decided that protecting prices mattered more than protecting its future. This is where the trap closes. Too big to fail. Moral hazard, social fracture. And the end game at this stage, a reasonable person might ask a dangerous question. Why doesn't the market correct this? If prices are too high, debt is too heavy. If affordability is broken, shouldn't gravity do its job? In theory, yes. In reality, not anymore. Because Canada no longer has a housing market. It has a protected asset class. Homeownership is the most powerful voting bloc in the country. Any government that presides over a serious housing correction doesn't just risk criticism. It risks extinction. So policy stops being economic. It becomes defensive. This is where moral hazard enters the story. Moral hazard is what happens when people take risks because they know someone else will absorb the losses. In Canada, that someone else is the public. Look at the mortgage system. If you buy a home with less than 20% down, your mortgage is insured by the state. Not to protect you, but to protect the bank. If you default, the lender is made whole by taxpayers. This means banks are encouraged to lend aggressively. Risk is offloaded. Losses are socialized. And when the market wobbled in 2023 and 2024, the response was immediate. Amortizations were extended. Liquidity was injected. Bond markets were backstopped. The idea of 30-year and longer mortgages was normalized. Every intervention had the same goal. Do not let prices fall. Not because falling prices are evil, but because falling prices would reveal the truth. That much of the wealth is leverage. That much of the stability is illusion. That the latter has been pulled up and nailed shut. So, instead of letting the system reset, Canada chose suspension. Like Japan in the 1990s, zombie assets. Zombie loans, zombie growth. This is the quieter ending, and often the crueler one. Not a crash, but stagnation. Nominal prices stay high. Inflation eats purchasing power. Wages lag. Young people delay everything. Marriage, children, risk. Canada's fertility rate has already fallen to historic lows. A society that cannot afford housing cannot afford a future. And that's how a caste system emerges. Owners and renters. The landed and the locked out. Those who bought early didn't cheat. They arrived first. But the system now exists to protect their paper wealth, even if it costs the next generation everything. And when people realize the game is unwinnable, something else happens. So competent leave. Engineers, doctors, founders. They look south and see higher wages, lower housing costs, more opportunity, and they go. Canada becomes a nursery and a nursing home. It raises the young. They leave during their productive years. They maybe return when they're old. That's not a growth model. That's a slow liquidation. So how does this end? There are only two paths: a sharp correction, painful, fast cleansing, or a long stagnation, comfortable, quiet, corrosive. Canada has chosen the second. And the real estate trap isn't just about houses. It's about where a nation puts its energy. When an entire generation spends its mental bandwidth worrying about rent, mortgages, and survival, it isn't inventing, it isn't building, it isn't dreaming. We trapped our future inside drywall and debt. Breaking the spell doesn't start with policy alone. It starts with honesty. High home prices are not success. They are inflation. They are failure deferred. A country with peace, resources, and educated people should be creating things, not hoarding shelters. Canada has everything it needs to be an economic powerhouse, but it locked it all inside a mortgage. And until that changes, the question isn't whether the system breaks. It's how much time is lost before reality is finally allowed back in.